Welcome to Below the 49th, the perspective on my neighbor to the south, below the 49th. I'm Michael A. Charbon. Today's title, H.R. 1, the Future Ballot. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, said, "The ballot is stronger than the bullet." George Carlin, American stand-up comic, and he was a social orator too, he said, "If you don't vote, you lose the right to complain. Don't you wish?" I like that. And finally, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general in World War II, he was also the 34th American president, and he said, "The future of this republic is in the hands of the American voter." Casting a vote is a privilege of being in a free society, a freedom that many have lost their lives to protect. Through elections, the public gives consent to a government to represent them. One man, one woman, one vote. In 2021, the process to cast a vote in America will be put up for discussion and a 21st century democratic interpretation proposed. House Resolution 1, or H.R. 1, was introduced in the 116th and 117th Congress by the Democrats. It's called the People Act. The proposed element is the election process, which is currently controlled and conducted by counties and certified by individual states, being moved to a federally controlled process, an effort to fundamentally transform voting to a standardized federal process where one size fits all. Some describe it as disenfranchising a state's autonomy, where today a state controls the process, the voter rolls, and maintains the actual execution. Others press the point that elections moving forward must be federalized to ensure standards and create consistent processes, kind of like in Canada. Further, they believe to federalize voting metrics is a must so as to instill integrity and trust in the act of voting. Their stated goal is to create a fair and honest election across the nation, to replicate the vote, kind of like a Big Mac, if you wish, looks the same, tastes the same at any franchise or voting booth across the country. Now, when you describe it like that, it seems quite palatable, right? I got it. In 2020, COVID-19 created an election anomaly where the absentee voting and mass printing of ballots was touted as a necessary process to address a public under the unprecedented ravages of a pandemic. Below the 49th does not, I repeat, does not question or wish to debate the validity of the last election or its processes, good or bad. Not interested. This piece is to reflect on the proposed fundamental changes that H.R. 1 could enact and what those potential next versions of the voting process will become. No vote's perfect, there's always anomalies, but some cities and states have what one could say is less than a perfect record. This phenomenon was illustrated back in 1996 when Republican Bob Dole from Kansas was running against incumbent Democrat President Bill Clinton. Dole lost, but he made a revealing quote about the voting in 1996. Dole said, "When I die, I want to be buried in Chicago so I can stay active in politics." If you read between the lines on that little gem, it gives some insight into how some states perform, I should say, better than a perform. I mean, what a word, perform. Anyways, so what are some of the highlights? Here they come. H.R. 1 proposes to mandate the following: the appointment of an independent commission that cannot be voted out, 15 days of early voting, online registration, same-day voter registration, banning mandatory voter ID signature and verification. The states count votes 10 days after elections, so they can count it up to 10 days. Federal control of voting areas and redistricting. Inclusion of illegal aliens in redistricting considerations, so no gerrymandering is what they've called it, where the Federal Election Commission would be reduced from 6 seats to 5. Automatic voter registration with driver's licenses, welfare, Social Security, and Medicare. It prohibits states from routine voter list purgings of ineligible voters, the deceased, or even using the Postal Service data as a cross-reference. That makes sense. It allows for ballot harvesting, convicted felons to vote, vote by mail for all who choose, and no-fault voting. So if you make a mistake on your ballot or put something wrong, your vote still counts. There are also some elements that require political ad transparency and mandatory tax return submissions of candidates against, other things that have gone on before. But those are just the highlights. Where many are having a problem with H.R. 1 is first and foremost the elimination of mandatory voter ID. A lot of the other ideas are valid, but voter ID has at times been accused of being a form of voter suppression and the disenfranchising of minority communities. They believe that by mandating that anyone who wishes to vote must substantiate their identity and citizenship with government ID, it's racist, it's unfair, and it's a suppression and racialization of communities from voting. And by mandating these issues is a restrictive measure. Civil rights groups have for years stated that racialized communities do not readily have government ID and as a result have their rights tramped on. Here's another perspective. The rebuttal to those points identify planes, trains, welfare, accepting couriers, even entering certain government buildings, and many more that all necessitate picture ID to validate one's identity. Mandating voter ID is not a form of voter suppression. It's a confirmation that you, as an American citizen, have a legitimate voice in determining who you wish to govern. I'd also add that many states and civil rights groups have successfully signed up many racialized communities with ID. Think of the Obama election. Specifically, so they can vote in states who have mandatory ID policies already in place. So there's processes and organizations who are very willing to address anyone who wishes to obtain picture ID. Here's a different perspective. Delroy Murdoch, an African-American political commentator and contributing editor with the National Review, stated that the accusation that mandatory voter ID is a form of voter suppression for African-Americans is bigoted, anti-black, and filth. He believes black Americans show photo ID every day, no kidding. And to suggest that African-American voters are not capable of any type of voter ID is simply racist. Consider Nigeria, Guyana, South Africa, and a bunch of others. These proud black nations all demand voter ID. And for the record, Nelson Mandela also promoted voter ID. So the disenfranchised accusation today really is a failing excuse. So many Republicans feel that H.R. 1 really is a bad idea. And here are some of their suggestions. No more mass mail-in ballots that cannot be validated to the level of formal absentee ballots. It is election day, not election week or election month. No ballot harvesting. Mandatory voter ID. American citizens only can vote. Voter rolls cleaned and cross-referenced yearly. Again, those are just the highlights. There's a lot more, so you can delve in. It's online. So for some, they believe that H.R. 1 can potentially dilute the integrity of the vote, not strengthen it. I'd add that currently there exists a made-in-American voter process that already works. It has voter integrity, voter ID metrics. It addresses mail-in ballots and has already proven its legitimate success in the 2020 election. Where, you wonder? In Florida. Why wouldn't this voting achievement in Florida be the template for others instead of a new federal experiment? You know, another point would also be that whenever the federal government gets involved, the cost goes up, bureaucracy becomes deep and cumbersome, you know, the department grows, more people, more stuff, and it just gets out of control. And the increases in costs were probably pegged at rates that would never be tolerated by independent organizations, or states for that matter. So America, H.R. 1 has a massive implication on the integrity of the vote and who and how the next election will be conducted. The issue demands America's attention and a phone call to your state representative and your senator because it will affect you. And finally, one final quote here that resonates with me. It was from a Greek general and orator, Pericles. It's from 429 BC. Imagine the insight even back then. Pericles said, "Just because you do not take interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take interest in you." Cool. Finally, please click and share. And if you do, kindly subscribe. If you leave a comment, I try to answer everyone. I thank you for those considerations. And until next time, God bless and please stay safe. I'm Michael A. Charbon for Below the 49.